Howdy folks, welcome to another episode of the DevOps Diaries podcast, and in very exciting news I have for the very first time, a returning guest, and today joining me on the podcast is none other than Andy Barrick, one of the DevOps architects at Gearset. Andy, what a pleasure it is to have you back on the podcast.
Well, likewise, Jack. Thank you very much for having me back. It was a pleasure last time, episode 4, I think it was, and I'm really looking forward to this one as well.
Yeah, I'm really looking forward to this one as well. The episode 4 was way back in 2022. How have things changed since 2022 in our DevOps space? Right off the bat, I'm curious what your perspective is there.
Well, I mean, I guess the biggest change, and I guess this sort of topic would appear in sort of anything what's different since 2022. Obviously, the emergence of AI has probably been the biggest sort of sea change that we've seen in that time, and it's definitely got the conversations I'm hearing are people are thinking a lot more about not necessarily AI as such, but AI potentially as a solution to the question of how can we automate more stuff, which is right in DevOps wheelhouse, isn't it? People are looking at stuff and thinking potentially the first iteration of the question is, oh, could AI do this? But the fundamental way that they're thinking is, can we automate this a bit more? Is there something that we can do to take away the manual step of this? And that's great because that's got people thinking completely in DevOps' space. And so we're seeing a lot more conversations around that behavior rather than necessarily having solved all the things about metadata dependencies and all these kind of things. People are now ready to take another step forward into the world of automating more things.
Yeah, no, a cornerstone of the DevOps lifecycle, or something that is wrapped around the DevOps lifecycle, as we like to talk about. One of those 4 pillars around it is automation, and I think to your point as well, the technology ecosystem, Salesforce ecosystem specifically, is more ready for it now because they're using AI in their daily lives often now anyway. It's just, how do we apply this and how can we automate some steps for us to make our lives easier? And something you and I have been talking about for years and years is automating things through CI/CD, and now people are already there. They already have a taste and a flavor, or a more embedded taste and flavor for automation in their day-to-day work, which must make those conversations, especially that you have around CI/CD and other automated testing and other practices, a lot more initially palatable.
For sure.
Where there might have been resistance primary.
Without a doubt. And I think it's definitely something that's got to be done incrementally. It's going to be very rare, but not impossible, to sort of take a huge big bang approach and just say, let's automate everything. It would have been really difficult. I think it would be very difficult for someone to come in fresh with nothing and just go right up to 100%. So the work and that everyone's done to get to a point where they're comfortable with CI/CD and the automation around that, and having intelligence in the process for solving that, things like environment variables and all these kinds of things that you could, if they emerge today, you might brand them as AI, the problem analyzing Gearset and this sort of thing. That's a great base once you've got everything set there to then go on to the next step. So it's really heartening that people are also looking in that direction and asking these questions of us and wanting answers, and that's a really exciting time when you're getting as many questions as you're giving out answers.
Yeah, for sure. I guess the flip side of that question, what hasn't changed in DevOps in the last 3-4 years?
I think testing. I think testing's really so the fundamentals of it, right? There's definitely one of these things where you can. That is one of those areas where you might sprinkle AI in and say, well, they could do this, and there's, to a degree, that can happen. But I mean, the fundamentals of what you should test, how you should test it, remain unchanged, right? There's certainly ways in which AI can help do this. I mean, I keep coming back to the point that you get these things that can drive the UI and do all sort of clever stuff, and they're really cool. They are really cool, but there's a risk that they're used in the wrong way, and they are a good analog for people clicking around, manual testers going around in the UI. But if it's being used as a alternative to proper testing of unit tests, service tests based in Apex, because it's more accessible, or it's easier, or it's just cooler and more exciting because it's automated and AI driven, then that can be dangerous. Dangerous in the sense of it can slow you down, you'll find stuff later, it can shift you right a bit. So those principles of, although the mechanisms might have changed, the underlying principles of things like testing are definitely still as true now as they were then, without a doubt.
Yeah. Yeah, and something I wanted to talk to you about, I would see as somewhat tangentially related to testing. Obviously, testing is as much about prevention of problems as it is stability of the environment that you're currently operating in. Obviously, when you deploy new things, you may want to make sure that things aren't breaking or haven't broke. So preventative from that measure, and also prevent you from putting bad code or bad features into a production environment. Which kind of leads me to something that we are seeing a lot more of and a lot more focus on in the DevOps lifecycle as folks are more attuned to the process. They're more familiar with the release and the automating their release. They've got their backups and their archiving strategy. But one of those things that I think people are more conscious of these days is the health of their Salesforce orgs, especially their production orgs. They have more visibility into what is happening and changes that they might not have been privy to. We would refer to that as observe or observability as a solution area for Salesforce. What is observability? I think I've probably just introduced a new topic to a bunch of people here that they might not be familiar with. But observability, from your perspective, Andy, what is that when we think about Salesforce and maintaining a good production org?
Sure, that's a great question. I'm gonna start tackling it by moving away from Salesforce, but off Salesforce completely. Your linked testing, I think, is really useful. And in fact, at TDX earlier this year, I did a talk at TDX that linked testing and observability, but through the mechanism that you achieve them both. And I'm sure we'll dig into that later. But I think I'm always using metaphors most often about cars, but I think it works really well in this example. So, if you go buy a car, right? It's gone through a manufacturing plant. All the components have been tested individually, like all the way down to the bulbs and the the stalks and the buttons on the panels and all this sort of stuff are kind of tested individually. And then as the car's sort of put together and built, it's tested in a more and more integrated fashion until ultimately, someone's driving it or it's on a rolling road or whatever. But that obviously doesn't mean that when someone buys this car, it's never going to go wrong. There's still things that can happen, and one of the ways in which you, as the driver, will get this is like through your dashboard. I hopefully that translates culturally. I don't know the sort of international terminology for it, but the instrumentation panel you've got basically sat behind the steering wheel that's got these lights coming on that tell. So if you didn't have that, you'd just drive the car and it would just stop at somebody, run out of fuel, or the engine would overheat, and you'd be like, "Oh, I had no idea," right? You just drive into something because the brakes had failed. But ultimately, how this relates back to Salesforce then is you do all this testing through your development process, your validation, and you're catching stuff just like in the factory there, finding dodgy components and replacing stuff and fixing things up. But once it's in production, once the thing's on the road, you still need some mechanism to say, especially as you continue to customize it, hey, right, things aren't necessarily quite as they should be here. And there's multiple different factors to observability, but the core of it is that you get information out of your application that tells you about the health of it, its current status. And it's not always necessarily about warning lights and things going wrong. It's great to know that things aren't right. That's just as important information to an end user, to an admin, to somebody maintaining a production org, as the fact that, hey, you've got 99% of your storage usage is taken up, which again is sort of visible through Salesforce, but there are other elements, and I'm sure we'll start breaking them down exactly what these subcomponents of observability are. But at a high level, that's the principle, right? You're getting data out of your application just in its normal executed running state to let you know how it's getting on.
Yeah. Yeah, to your point of to continue with your theme of analogy, you want to know that the fuel gauge is up. You want to know how much fuel is in your car, and
Yeah,
the same thing goes for Salesforce. Yes, I've got fuel in the car. Like if that wasn't there, then people would be having a panic attack and not knowing
exactly,
when they're gonna have to call a friend or walk to a gas station.
precisely that.
Yeah. And something that we've spoken about as well is that there's two flavors to observability: a reactive and a proactive approach to
Absolutely.
observability. Can you break those down for us?
Yeah, for sure. I think we can even go further than that, but let's stick with those two for to start with. So I think reactive is probably the better place to start, right? So there's a lot of stuff that Salesforce give you, right, in UIs and so on. So we spoke about storage usage, file usage. You can go to the company information page and see your API rolling 24-hour consumption. You can go into the object manager and see how far through the custom field limit you are, 500 or whatever you've got it extended to. You can go and see how many characters of Apex you used out of a limit, which is also extendable if you wish to do so. So you get a bit of information, and you even in some cases get an email from Salesforce saying, "Hey, you're at 90% of this," or something like that. But ultimately, in a lot of scenarios, you'll get notification of this when you've broken it, right? You either try and put a field in, it says, "Oh no, you've reached your limit," or you try and save a document or insert some records, and you're at 107% or whatever of your data storage, and Salesforce just won't let you. Equally, if you take it from org level down into transaction level, you might have users who are doing their day-to-day work, trying to save an account or something like that, update a field, and they'll get a big red thing across the top of the screen saying, unhandled exception, or some code-based information or some Salesforce native error message, and they're like, okay, right, what's that?
Something unhelpful.
Precisely, absolutely. In some cases, deliberately unhelpful, because if it's failed in a managed package, for example, you can't expose any of the internals of that, so you just get a really short message with none of the actual information on where the code that was executing at the time, etc. But ultimately, you've got a scenario where something's gone wrong. You've encountered this is your engines, actually overheated, right? This is something's gone wrong, and that starts a cycle, typically, of you've got to first of all understand that this thing has happened, right? If you're in charge of the application and developing and maintaining it, making sure that your users are successful and productive, you've then got to sort of analyze it, and then you've got to potentially fix it. You might analyze it and say, well, that was just user error, right? We just didn't handle that scenario where you didn't fill that field in properly or whatever, 3 steps beforehand. But you might need a fix as well. And obviously all that takes time. And this is in production. So there's a business standstill of some degree. It might be a user clicking a button in the screen to do one really rare thing, or it might be like your overnight monthly billing process that suddenly you've got 5,000 accounts without an invoice to send out the next morning because it failed at
Yeah,
some
that's
point.
bad news.
Exactly. So you need to get this information. And the way that Salesforce handle this, typically, if these things aren't handled, is that Salesforce handle it if it's not handled. This is actually how it works, right? So we've got these things called unhandled exceptions. So you can write code and such like to say, if this thing happens, do this. But if there's nothing in place to do that, or you hit a governor limit, which by their very nature can't be handled, then Salesforce will just generate an email. And its methodology for who it sends it to is either it will look at a setting in the setup area of the UI where it determines like a list of, you can put in a list of email addresses to send these things to. If that's not set, it'll just send it to the last person, the last modified by for that particular component, which may or may not be particularly useful at all. If you've got like a service account that does your deployments into production, this service account user is going to get a bunch of emails about stuff that's failed, and it's not a human, right? So it might not be a monitored inbox. But Salesforce is going to send this out. There's an email there saying something went wrong, and it's not. It's probably the best that they can do, really, because they don't know the internal kind of bug P1 processes at each company, so that's the best they can provide. But it's not always a particularly satisfactory experience. But this is so reactive observability reacts to these things happening and promotes visibility of this. That's what it's all about. It's shortening that time from occurrence to that kind of analytical stage where you work out what caused this. Is it a bug? Is it user error? All that sort of stuff. That's the principle underlying that sort of phase.
Yeah. And I suppose with reactive as well, something that we hear quite a lot, I hear quite a lot, is the first time we find out about an issue is because a user is stopped from doing work. Or
Absolutely.
if our observability strategy is waiting on end users to report errors to us or issues to us, then we're kind of in a bit of a losing situation because, to your point, you just mentioned they might be doing something rare or something that only happens once a month or once a quarter when they try and do something maybe reporting based, like we need to do quarterly reporting and that's broken. And humans, with the best intent in the world, like we often leave things to the last minute, and that'll be a priority for them when they go and do that task, and then they're blocked, and then they've run into an issue, and this bug might be a 2, 3, 4 day fix. You never really know. So it's relying on users to inform you of issues is a fairly poor strategy, or sifting through maybe hundreds of emails from at help.salesforce.com or whichever email address it comes from.
Absolutely. And with the best one, I'd love to have this sort of completely kind of total recall photographic memory where I could sort of instantly tell you exactly everything that I did. But if I'm an end user and I hit an error, can I faithfully recall exactly what I was doing in the last 30 seconds? I was on there and I put that value into that field and that into that field, and then I clicked that and then I went there. And you're not sort of storing this stuff as you go through, in the event that you might hit something that someone maybe 2 days later says to you, can you tell me exactly what you were doing here? And of course the error might not be anything that you've done. It might be some data that was missed 3 months ago when some other related record that was set, that now the code that you're executing expects a value for, and you're just like, well, I didn't say anything wrong. So it's not necessarily even going to be within the user's recall, the cause of the bug. So it's, and we've heard, I don't think it's uncommon at all for people to, even if they've got like an inbox where these emails are going, to just get so many in, especially if you're doing this. Because the other alternative is, of course, you haven't got a user sat there. You've maybe got some overnight batch process churning through thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions of records, and it's hitting exceptions as it tries to do stuff. And these are generating emails, and somebody comes in the morning. We've even heard cases of teams that are, whose like first task of the day is to go to the inbox, see what we got, and you confronted with like 650 emails errors. Like, whoa, okay, right. What are all these things? There might be 650 separate ones. It might be the same thing on different records. 650. There's just it's a starting point, but there's still typically so much of the process left to do. You've got visibility, but that time from visibility to action being taken is with these emails can be huge, because it's literally just the first point. You've got to do a lot of processing to understand exactly what's going on there.
Yeah, and I'd say one of the biggest things that I've learned through research that I've done and talking to hundreds of thousands of Salesforce customers and admins, developers, architects, you name it, is the thing that they enjoy doing the most is actually building good solutions on the platform. They don't want to be fixing all these errors, and if these errors are unhelpful or people don't have the recall to help them solve that error quickly, then it gets in the way of them doing the things that they enjoy, 100%. And therefore gets in the way of the business delivering value on the platform first and foremost as well, because that's ultimately what we're here to do. We're here to design and build a system that is going to drive business growth and fuel the business as it moves forward. If we're in that situation and we have a reactive approach to observability, then we're going to find ourselves in some hot water. Tell me about the proactive approach then, because I imagine the proactive approach is going to help us. And you mentioned kind of shift left, but you talked about shifting right a little bit as well. But I imagine if we have a proactive approach to tie it back into testing and things that we should be familiar with in a kind of shift left approach, I imagine proactive observability kind of folds into shifting even further left and back through the life cycle, even before you go into a planning stage.
Absolutely, that's bang on, Jack. Just to round off the reactive stuff. and this ties up to where we're going to go with the proactive area, is that obviously if you're thinking about production org and you've got a lot of work in progress in your system, say you've got a UAT org just before production, so users hit some exception, even if you've got the email, right, you as a developer have got this, where do you actually go to explore this and understand what went on? You've got a UAT org that's got a load of work in progress that isn't actually the same as your production environment. You might or may not have access to it. So you've got barriers there, even in that phase, to understand or to try and replicate what went on. So what proactive observability is, it's very much as it suggests, it's about getting ahead of this stuff. So I spoke about sort of breaking it down even more potentially, and I think this is where possibly we can do it. There are, let's say there's a couple of types of thing that we're going to observe about. So we spoke earlier on about like org level limits. You know, you've got your 24-hour rolling API calls, platform event consumption, storage usage, and all this sort of stuff. These are things that they're at org level. And you can see these in places in the UI, but you might be able to sort of track them and look for spikes and know not to schedule loads of certain jobs together at the same time at 2 a.m. in the morning because they all use lots of platform events, all this sort of stuff. You can then go down to transaction level, though. We spoke about governor limits, and whilst you've got all those limits that we spoke about at org level, you've got even more limits or more challenging limits, let's say, down at transaction level. So if a user's doing something, all the CPU, the number of SQL queries, the number of rows you can affect in DML statements in transaction, all these things will combine at some point to potentially, something might break, the more you put into a business process. And this is where the real exciting bit of proactive observability is huge value, the shift left stuff. It takes work, right? There's no getting away from it, but the value that you can get is huge. And what we're talking about here is you don't have, we spoke about getting emails, let's say when you go to 90% of your storage usage and all this sort of stuff. What you do not get at all from Salesforce is any indication that, let's say, if I've updated an opportunity, right, and that's kicked off a load of background processing because I've set it to a new stage or something like that, that operation used 98% of my CPU limit or my SQL queries or something like that. If you've got the Salesforce debug logs on, you'd actually get stuff printed out at the bottom, but you can't have these things on all the time. They take up space. There's only so much space that they get and all this sort of stuff. They only last 24 hours. So you might observe it by having the logs on at the time incidentally or something like that. But ultimately, if you don't get visibility that a business process is reaching, you don't have this warning light, right? This is like driving with no petrol light or gas light, all right, in your transactions. And these are the bread and butter of your business processes, right? So if you say, I've closed an opportunity, just a normal opportunity, I've changed its stage to this, but that uses 98% of my CPU limit, let's say, nothing's flagging that to you at the moment. And so that if you make some adjustments, some enhancement to the process, some additional bit of processing that has to happen, you might find that when you deploy this new change, that takes you over the limit, right? This takes you over the 10-second limit because you're now doing a bit more stuff. You didn't realize you were so close to the limit, and now it breaks. And the proactive observability is about injecting places in defined business processes where you are taking snapshots of these limits, which you can do in using Apex, to say, tell me what it's like here, and then at the end of the process, you can tell me what it's like here, and then you can subtract one for the other, and you say, okay, that's what this used. Now you don't get this out of the box on the platform. This is where you need to use. You need to develop this and put this in yourself. But there are frameworks, so things like Nebula Logger, which do this automatically, will log or allow you to log limit consumption throughout the scope of a transaction. It's dependent very much, and this is why it links well to testing and the testing triangle, and that whole analogy of components in the car building up into like the brake pedal into the braking system into the whole car, that you have these sort of modules, these components of isolated actions which do things separated from business process. Apply a discount to a value, something like that. Then you build it up into a service, which is just a chain of these components stuck together. Maybe if I change the tier of an account from silver to gold, right, a load of and discounts applied to the opportunities. So that's the one process. I have one action at the start, update account from status of this to that. And one of the components in that service is discount, that discount thing, right? We send in one value, we discount by a percentage, and then we're testing that sort of bit more end to end. Now, if you could go as far as sort of taking these snapshots either side of the component, say how efficient is this? You get over to like F1 style engineering where you're getting real little data points, loads and loads of data points out of little bits. It's not where you'd start, right? You'd start at the business process and my account update process. If I update the tier of an account, right, I want to take a snapshot at the start, snapshot at the end. How expensive is that? If that's a particularly common business process, you probably don't want to find out late on in the game that actually if we change this, we're potentially going to blow a governor limit and we won't be able to do this until we rectify it. And this is exactly where you can bring this left, right? You don't have to just find out in production. If it's sort of atomic, like how long does it take an account to get updated? You can do this in any sort of representative org. If there are volume concerns, maybe it needs to be something that's a bit more like a full copy org. But you're not reliant on finding this in production. It's a great way of bringing this left, of getting more confidence into your plan phase. If the requirement is we need to add something else into what happens when we upgrade an account's tier. Somebody in theory with this data could go along and say, okay, well, we're using 98 out of 100 SOCL when we in this process. So, if we're looking at querying any more stuff, then we're going to have to maybe refactor it. So let's plan that in, or break it. Let's have a prerequisite feature to sort of rationalize this process and take some of the heat out of the limit consumption. So it can radically change how you approach, how you develop your application, and give you much more stability and confidence in the changes you're making.
Yeah, it's the way that you're explaining it is like observability is visibility to some extent. It
Absolutely
makes
right.
the rest of the process clearer. It's going to make your lives easier. Like come back to what I said. That's like 9 times out of 10, most people don't want to be fixing bugs, which is a situation that I think most Salesforce professionals find themselves at a lot of times. They go, we have got this backlog of things that we need to fix before we can even move forward. What are some steps we can take to prevent this from happening in the future? Or how can we plan better? To your point as well, how can we plan better and to know that we might hit this issue? This work is actually not going to be able to go into this sprint. It's going to be in over the next 3 sprints so that we can actually do this effectively, rather than trying to do it in the sprint and then the next 2 sprints being thrown off whack because we would have to do it anyway.
Exactly.
I guess one of these things is just how proactive can we be across the whole DevOps lifecycle? And observability to me seems like a key piece of being able to be proactive in the first instance.
It is, absolutely. The benefits, like, you can't underplay that it is, as we stand today, an effort to put this in, right? We spoke about F1, right? Back in the day, they just drove the cars till they broke, right? Now there's sensors everywhere, and they can predict stuff, and they've got so much data flying around. But that just didn't happen, right? The front wings didn't just grow sensors, right? They had to do a hell of a lot of engineering to actually put this in and consume all the data. I mean, it's obviously not necessarily that sort of scale in the Salesforce application. But as it stands at the moment, although Salesforce collecting data internally, and there's maybe like the signature support plan where you can get access to some observability data that Salesforce are capturing about your application, and you can also go into like the debug mode and Lightning Web Components and actually see how efficient they are. You can get metrics about performance of your components. To the large extent, when you get down to that transaction level, you're going to have to put some stuff in. But the benefits of it, right, having that sort of much more data-driven development process, again, ultimately that knowledge that actually your application's all right. So as it stands today, if you're using Salesforce and you're doing your job, you don't know if the process you're doing that you on a daily basis, close a case, whatever it might be, open a case, whether that's on the verge of breaking or perfectly healthy. And we go back to that warning light in the car. That's you wouldn't drive a car if you didn't know whether it was about to fall over, break or not. So
Yeah.
that's the principle here. It's like we said, the work, there is work needed to put it in, but the value you get out of it is immense. And once you get thinking, to your point there about bringing it to DevOps, it is DevOps, right? It's absolutely getting data to feed back into the plan phase for something else, making much more informed decisions about it, and ultimately getting automation to extract that information from your application so that you've continually got visibility about the stability of the application, the value of changes, the impact of changes that you're going to make.
Yeah, for sure. Where's an easy place for people to start? Because I appreciate that this still is a fairly new concept, and when most people think about DevOps, they even still, and I've worked at GearSet for 6 years. You've been round the block much longer than that in terms of Salesforce and DevOps. Not to age you any, just for the record. But it's still one of the newer things we think of DevOps. People think of DevOps and they go, how do we create a CI/CD pipeline?
Mm-hmm.
How do we do better testing? Those tend to be the two things that people think about most and care about most. There's still some work to be done to elevate folks to think about, like backup as part of their DevOps process, which it absolutely is.
Yeah.
Observability for newcomers, I guess. This is the first time that somebody's thought about observability. They've listened to you explain this is kind of the benefit. This is the benefits. They get the analogy and they're like, yes, I want some warning lights. I want some better visibility, some more data points, and to be able to plan effectively for the future, of my org. Where do people start on an observability journey if this is an unfamiliar topic to them, or something that they don't currently do?
Cool. Yeah, well, I think a little bit of promotion. We did release a white paper at GearSet on observability, which encompasses everything we've spoken about, goes into more detail, but presents it in a non sort of really dry and technical. You're not going to see lots of sort of technical drawings of car components or anything like that in there. So that's always worth checking out. But I think one of the best way to think about this, if you're on board with it, you sort of think, as you said there, Jack, this is something that we want to experiment with. The actual first phase to doing this successfully, which you may or may not have, is clear understanding of these business processes. Right, the one of the least optimal things to put it into, right, would be a scenario where the architecture is tangled. Where you've got, for example, one of these trigger handlers on a standard object that just is one huge sort of after insert method of 2,000 lines. I've seen those before in the past. I've contributed to those in the past, right? I've sort of come out as some sort of holier than thou who's never made bad architectural decisions. That's certainly not the case. But if you can isolate this thing, so we spoke about like that account tier upgrade process. If you can isolate something like that, and it doesn't have to be sort of complete re-architecture of the application, you just sort of think, right, let's identify a core business process that if it stopped working would be like really problematic for us, or maybe has you've experienced this in the past, right? You've released a change to production, it broke something important. P0, all hands on deck, weekends cancelled, all that sort of stuff. If you've got any sort of scar tissue from that sort of thing, these are really good places to think about just chucking some metrics in. Like there's a method there's a class called limits in the APE standard, the system namespace name limits, and there's a couple of methods on there that will allow you to capture the state of the transaction limits at that point. Put it at the start, put it at the end of that process, and then you can capture this information, and then you can sort of work out from there exactly if this is fine. Then maybe look for other things. For reactive observability, though, I'm gonna recommend our GearSet trial for that, because this is where you can have GearSet ingest the emails that are generated from Salesforce, group them, overlay them with like deployment metadata. So it's not. We spoke about cutting down that time from for reactive observability from occurrence to like action, if we want to put it that way. You get power to you can overlay it with deployment information. Say, hey, look, you changed this flow yesterday, and now look at this huge spike in emails, exceptions from that flow. That's really powerful, right? That's incredibly valuable to allow you to get back to or present a fix for this thing as soon as possible. The proactive stuff, start small. Absolutely start small. It's not going to be destructive, right? There is a small cost in CPU time for actually taking it's all a bit quantum, right? You observe something, you change its state, but it's small. It's really small, and just having that information, right? In the end, you could have all sorts of advanced dashboards and like events flying around when certain thresholds are reached and all this sort of stuff. That's a wonderful, wonderful end state somewhere down the line. Simply getting this information out at the very initial stage is like, I don't know, 60% of the value of this thing, and you can do something really simple to get huge insight into what's happening in your org and your application.
Yeah, it's I always love when people remind people to start small and start with incremental improvement, and it's the core. Anytime I do a talk, it's like one of the core tenets of DevOps is continual incremental improvement. Get better at getting better, which is the Dora way of saying that. And it doesn't need to be big change. If we go back to the a common space that people are familiar with, CI/CD processes, you don't bang all your metadata through a CI/CD process straight away. You do it with the things that are familiar and you know how to handle, and you can automate quickly, and then you gradually add and increase the metadata that goes through that process. For example, a lot of folks still leave out profiles and permissions as part of their CI/CD process. They prefer to handle those manually, for example, when building out an initial CI/CD process, because we all know if you mess up a profile or permissioning based metadata, then you can have some pretty big issues or even lack of visibility into when those things happen, and it's going to have a bigger issue. But that small incremental improvement is something that I think we can't harp on enough about, whether it be the technology or whether it be the process itself or whether it be how you interact with each other as a team and collaborate as a team. Incremental improvements to all of those things over time have compounded benefit.
Exactly right. In a lot of these cases, the value is huge. We sort of expanded, as we have done in this session, this call. We've gone into a lot of detail about like the kind of implications, and it all seems huge and big, and but actually the process for implementing this, you can get lots of value from very small changes to start with, and that's you just need to know like what are the critical paths in my application that would be a real problem if they were to be if they were to go down, right? If they were to stop, or and it might be at org level, right? How aware are you of that, very simply put, things like the storage limits, the file storage limits, even at org level. Are you regularly brushing up towards your API 24-hour limit? Are there spikes in the day when that's getting really close and it sort of tapers off over the day because you've clustered everything together? You wouldn't want to come in first thing in the morning and then all your overnight processes have failed because one job consumed all the limits, and then because it's a 24-hour rolling thing, they've all stopped. So there's loads of aspects, loads of ways into this for sure, but the principle's exactly the same. Just identify one or two critical things to start with, get familiar with how you actually extract this data and see it and how you use it, and that becomes a repeatable process as you want to scale this out.
Yeah. Aside from GearSet, you mentioned Nebula Logger as being something quite helpful in this space. Is it, aside from Nebula Logger, is there anything else in this space that you found really useful, like in your work, when you think about Salesforce and the tools that might make your life easier? And obviously it's not as simple as just buy a tool and then all your problems will be fine, because then you've got to do something with that information, which we have talked about. But is there anything else that can help kickstart journeys on this path?
Yeah, for sure. So Nebula, you're right. It's a great thing for capturing that data. It's still, then you've got to do something with it. Absolutely. But there's also Pharos, which is a platform for setting up, being able to ingest this data and give you those insights into your application, and be an observability platform for your Salesforce application as well. Again, that also relies, because you don't want anything to be sort of magically scattering code around your application based on sort of computation of where it thinks it should put it in. The same applies with Pharos, right? You're going to have to put markers in to say, right, start capturing here, and this is a significant point, and that's a significant point, to take these sort of snapshots of data. But then that will take this and ingest it and do lots of crunching and nice graphs and all this sort of stuff for you as well.
Yeah,
But
and if you're yeah, go on.
Oh, sorry, I was going to say, but it is a really nascent space, right? I think observability as a whole is not particularly old in the in the scheme of application management, DevOps, and this sort of stuff. And Salesforce, not surprisingly, is a little, the Salesforce world is that little bit behind the other areas where this happens, because the challenges of a managed platform, it's more difficult to actually get this stuff out of there. So I'm sure if we come back to this in 12, 18 months, there'll be a bigger list of options for people. But at the moment, they're the main players.
Yeah, and if CRM platform owner, Salesforce platform owner, or director of business systems, or somebody happens to be listening to this part of the podcast, is we start along this path of observability, we get all this new information about things that need to be fixed. What's your view on balancing what's the right word? What's the right word? What word am I thinking of, Andy? Like refactoring, I guess.
Okay. Yeah.
What would be your advice on, we've got all this new information, we've got things that we obviously need to we've identified that could be improved or what have you. And I spoke earlier about people like to build new things and things that deliver value for the business. Refactoring isn't always in software engineering seen as like the sexiest thing to do. What would be your approach if you were owning an instance and saying, we've got a bunch of things that need to be fixed, but we also need to continue to make strides in improving the platform? You might have another cloud that you're looking to implement, or you might be doing a CPQ project, or any one of 100 things that you can do on the Salesforce platform. What's your balance between refactoring, fixing things that could potentially break, versus keeping momentum on new initiatives and projects?
Yep. Well, one methodology I've definitely worked under is allocating a set chunk of every development iteration, sprints in the case I was working in, to technical debt refactoring, 15-20% of a sprint. It's a bit of a blunt instrument, potentially, in a lot of ways. You've got to identify the stuff to fix. You don't want to just sort of, but it opens up that question, like, how do you create a sort of single comparable value mechanism for this work, regardless of whether it's a new feature or it's technical debt? Because ultimately, with this 20% rule, you could end up picking out some really obscure technical debt for stuff that's hardly ever used over a really valuable feature, because hey, we've filled up the 80% of the new stuff, so we can't take that on now. It comes down to having a good awareness of what talk about those business processes again. What are the critical routes through your application, right? If you are thinking about refactoring and you're coupling that with the observability, right? So your warning light comes on and it's the same color, right? If it started sort of, maybe as a scale, right? It goes like yellow, orange, and then red. How severe is this issue, right? Is it something that's not going to take any more load? Is one more person on the bridge it's going to break, or have you got a bit of leeway because it's it's sort of starting to creak a little bit? This is information that you can now access and get, and clearly that can help a prioritization decision. So I think I would. It comes with knowledge. I definitely address it, right? That refactoring isn't sexy. You're absolutely right there, Jack. But it's sexy if we have levels of this, right? It's a lot sexier than losing a night or a weekend to fixing bugs when you've got like management on the phone saying, why isn't it fixed yet? That's very unpalatable. So it's about preventing the worst stuff from happening, as unglamorous as it might be. So if you can identify that it's a critical or important area of the application, or it's something that is like right on the edge of failing, then that's a really good candidate for addressing. If it's if it's not either of those things, then maybe a feature is more valuable. But if you've got a good way of valuing features, you don't want to just build stuff that nobody's going to use. So you equally need to understand how often these things actually get implemented and used.
Yeah. It feels like a bit of a full circle moment. You mentioned AI at the start of the podcast, and one of the biggest change to the DevOps landscape in the last 3 years or so. But with that has come the importance of risk management. I feel like risk management is one of those things that people are thinking about and talking about more. And ultimately, this folds into that. Like, what is, to use your bridge analogy, what is the risk if we don't solve these issues? If we don't have visibility into things that might cause our org to fall over, that risk management piece I think is shedding its light, and observability is tied quite closely to that in my mind from what I've heard from you and as this space has been developing.
Definitely. I mean, I'll be very quick here, but I think we could have another session on this. Like observability, like AI, it can take in so much. If you've got a whole application base and you're using like co-pilots to generate code or new processes and whatnot, how do you know that it's taking into account like the most efficient way of doing stuff? It's not duplicating code. If you've got something like Copilot, or you're using AI in the development process, being able to then get observability out of what it's created to say, hey, look, actually, crikey, this thing's now degraded the account update process by 20%. We didn't expect that to happen. Why not find that out as early as possible rather than in production when all the users hit it and all of a sudden you've only realized when things start breaking in prod that was not actually the change that you wanted.
Yeah. Andy, thank you so much for sharing your wisdom and your advice and educating us all on what is a relatively new space. Is there any final comments that you'd like to leave for the listeners on your second trip around the DevOps Diaries sun?
Well, thank you very much for having me on again, Jack. It's been an absolute pleasure. I'm welcome, really happy to take any comments or queries or questions about it. If people are out there thinking I like the sound of what we can do with this, but I'm concerned about the lift it might take, then I'm always happy to explore more in depth with anybody about the principles behind this and how it doesn't have to be daunting, and how even at small levels the value can easily outweigh the effort that you've put in. So I would just encourage everybody to at least have a look through it, see what you can gain from it. If you've got something brilliant in place, fantastic. If you haven't, then there's definitely stuff that you can be really scaling up and leveling up your DevOps, your development processes within observability. So I thoroughly recommend people exploring this as much as they possibly can.
Good. Andy, thank you so much. Listeners, you can find Andy on LinkedIn, Andy Barrick on LinkedIn.
That's me.
What's your email address these days? andy.barrick@gearset.com.
That's it. Spot on. Absolutely.
There you go. Feel free to reach out to Andy. Andy, thank you once again for being a guest on the podcast. There is never a conversation with you that I don't learn something. So
well, likewise,
I appreciate that, and keep sharing.
Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure, Jack. Thank you.
Cheers, Andy. Thank you, listeners. If you enjoyed the episode, be sure to like and subscribe on whatever platform that you're listening on. It helps me more than you know. And I will catch you on another episode sometime soon.